There are places where sunlight is only a memory, where mist clings to the bones of the land like a second skin. And on one such forgotten stretch of northern shoreline, where the sea howls even on still days, there lies a village the maps no longer name. Locals call it the Silent Village. No music lives here, no laughter echoes between the salt-stained walls, no dogs bark, no children shout. Only the bells ring, soft, metallic whispers worn around the necks of widows. Small iron bells, rusted with time and salt, swaying with each breath of wind, and they are never to be removed, never to be silenced. No one comes here by accident. The single path into the village winds along jagged cliffs, slick with moss and fog, treacherous even to those who know it by heart. When the coastal mist thickens in autumn, you could walk past a house and not know it was there. Lamps give no guidance. The fog swallows light like breath. The villagers move quietly, purposefully. They believe that raised voices awake the drowned dead. When a widow passes, you don't see her, you hear her. The gentle, trembling chime of the bell on her throat is her only announcement, like a weeping spirit kept barely at bay. Long ago, the sea took too many husbands. Fishing boats never returned. Nets came up red and empty. Some say the ocean grew jealous. Some say the dead refused to stay beneath. So the elders made a pact. Every widow would wear a bell, forged from iron, blessed with ash, bound with threads soaked in mourning wine. Its sound, they claimed, would lull the lost souls back into the deep. Not silence, not prayers, only the bell. And so it remained for decades, generations. The widows walked the fog-bound streets with their small, sorrowful songs clinking softly against their hearts. But grief doesn't stay gentle forever. And in one home, a crooked cottage near the edge of the cliffs, a widow named Morel sat with her bell and her silence and her sorrow, until one day she took the bell off, and that was when the sea began to bring things back. The bell was not merely an ornament, it was a covenant, a quiet promise whispered between the living and the drowned. You may rest below as long as we remember above. No one could say exactly when the tradition began. Some traced it back to the first storm, when a fleet of 12 boats vanished in a single night, swallowed by a sea that had once fed the village for generations. Others claimed it began earlier, in the era of sea burials, when widows lined the cliffs and dropped tokens into the water, rings, hair, teeth. But all agreed on one thing. It wasn't about grief, it was about containment. The bell was given to a widow the moment her husband was declared lost. Not dead, never that. The sea did not always return bodies. It swallowed them, digested them, whispered them into the bones of the tide. And so, the bell became the stand-in for a funeral without a body, a sound instead of a casket. Each bell was small, forged from raw iron and wrapped in string dyed black with ink and brine. Before it was tied around a widow's throat, it was held over a bowl of seawater and anointed with her tears. The ritual was simple, but absolute. The bell is your burden and your offering. As long as it sings, he sleeps. Some wore it like armor, others like a shackle. Over the years, the bells became familiar, a chorus of soft clangs echoing in narrow alleys, the only music allowed in the silent village. Children were taught to hush when they heard them. Dogs were trained not to bark. Even the gulls, somehow, seemed to avoid the rooftops where widows dwelled. It was said that the drowned hated joy, that the sound of laughter could rouse them from the sea floor like sharks to blood. But the bell, that sad, tinny note, was a lullaby. It told them, "She still weeps. There is no need to rise." Not all believed, of course. A boy once snuck into the sea at night and tried to cut a bell from his mother's throat while she slept, thinking it nonsense. He was never found. Only his sandals returned, waterlogged, seaweed knotted around the straps. A traveler scoffed at the ritual, calling it superstition. That evening, the fog rolled in and never lifted from his cottage. The door remained closed. No smoke rose from the chimney again. Inside, only his bell remained, still warm to the touch. Now, only a few bells remained. The young had fled the village, fishing had dried. The sea grew quiet, but not still. And Mirelle, with her weary eyes and hollow home, wore the oldest bell of them all, rusted through the rim, the clapper barely hanging on. It hadn't rung in weeks, but she still wore it. Until that night. The night the grief finally stopped feeling sacred and started feeling cruel. The night she whispered to herself, "Let him come back if he wants. I have nothing left to lose." And she untied the thread from her throat. Mirelle had once been a woman of color and laughter. Before the sea took her husband, before her world became a room of peeling walls and fog-dimmed windows, she had worn yellow shawls and sang with the gulls. Now she moved like memory, faint, slow, echoing herself. She lived alone in a house closest to the cliffs, the kind of home people once fought over for its sea view, but no one envied her anymore. Not the crumbling porch, not the cracked windows, and certainly not the endless sound of waves gnawing at the stone below. Her bell, the oldest in the village, had not rung in weeks. The iron loop had thinned with time. The string had frayed, soaked too often with tears. And Mirelle herself had thinned too. Not in body, though she was slender, but in presence. She no longer attended the rituals. She did not leave flowers at the seawall. The others whispered, "She's forgotten how to mourn." Or worse, "She doesn't want him back." But none dared say it to her face, because there was still one thing Mirelle did. She watched the sea. Each night she sat by the attic window, wrapped in a blanket that once belonged to her husband, and stared, not at the water, through it. She searched for a shape, a shadow, a sign. Every widow did at first. Some saw illusions, a boat's mast that looked like a waving arm, driftwood that resembled a face. But they eventually gave up. Mirelle never did. And that is what frightened the villagers. They believed that too much longing opened doors, and doors left open too long let in more than just memory. Mirelle remembered the last thing her husband said before his boat slipped past the reef. "If I don't come back, don't look for me." He'd kissed her forehead as if he knew, as if the sea had already whispered his name. She hadn't cried that first week. She believed in tides, in returns. Even as the others lowered bells onto her neck, she told herself it was temporary. But weeks became months, then years. Then the silence stopped sounding peaceful and started sounding like punishment. She wore the bell like a collar, not a charm, a chain. There were days she forgot she was wearing it until it caught in her hair or tugged when she leaned forward. She stopped hearing it. The clink became part of her breath, her bones. Until the night it didn't ring at all. No wind, no tremble, only the sound of her own heart and the sea whispering below. That night she opened the drawer. Inside, among dried lavender and broken combs, lay the old box. She hadn't touched it in years. The place where she kept his ring, his letters, the small carved shell he once gave her. She took them out, one by one, and laid them on the table. Then slowly she reached up and untied the bell. It slipped off her neck with a sigh, the sound of surrender, of silence breaking its own silence. She placed the bell beside the shell, and for the first time in 7 years, Morel slept without it. She dreamed of footsteps, wet ones, on her stairs. Grief was never meant to be a lifetime sentence. At least, that's what Mirelle told herself when she awoke the next morning and found the bell still resting on her bedside table, untouched, unbothered, silent. The world hadn't ended. No storm had swallowed her house, no shadow stood at the foot of her bed. For a fleeting moment, she believed the stories were just that, stories. Tales forged in damp pews and echoed across generations by people too afraid to let go. "No one weeps forever," she whispered into the stillness. And still, she glanced at the bell. Its dull iron glinted faintly in the morning light, the string limp, like a snake that had shed its skin and died. The day moved slowly, as most days did. Mirelle boiled water, hung clothes to dry, tended to the salt-bitten herbs in her window box. Yet everything felt different. The silence was heavier, not oppressive, but expectant, like someone was holding their breath nearby. And then there was the sea. It didn't sound the same. She had lived by it her whole life, knew its many voices, the chatter of shallow tides, the growl of brewing storms, the lull of calm nights. But today, it murmured, not in waves, in words. Faint syllables in the hiss of foam, broken phrases in the lap of water against stone, not loud, not clear, but there. She stepped to the window. Far below, where the cliffs met the rocks, the sea surged differently, slower, thicker, as if something beneath the surface had begun to stir, not rise, but shift. That night, she did not put the bell back on. She stared at it for an hour, maybe 2, but her hands never moved. Instead, she lit a candle, placed it by the window, and returned to her attic chair, the same one where she had waited for 7 years. Only this time, she wasn't waiting. She was listening. And she heard it, a soft clatter just below her, like something dragging wet fabric across the entryway floor, like fingers slipping on wood. She didn't move. Then came the sound again, up the stairs, 1 step, then 2, slow, deliberate. She turned toward the attic door. It didn't open, but the candle flame shuddered violently, even though the window was closed. The scent of salt filled the air, thick and sudden, as if the tide had entered her home. And then came the sound she hadn't heard in weeks. The bell. Not hers, but one just like it, ringing, softly, from somewhere inside the house. Mirelle stood. Her knees ached,
but she moved like a woman not afraid, just tired. Tired of waiting, tired of pretending, tired of mourning. She descended the stairs in silence. The house was dark, but the sound led her like a thread. And there in the parlor, on the table where she had left the bell, lay something new. Her husband's wedding ring, still warm, as if it had just left his finger. And on the far wall, in the shadows near the coat rack, hung something wet, dripping. A jacket she had buried in a drawer 7 years ago, the one he wore the day he disappeared. She did not scream. She did not weep. Instead, she picked up the bell, held it to her ear. It made no sound, not even when she shook it, not even when she whispered, "Come home." The silence had changed. It was no longer absence. It was attention.
Morning came slow and gray, a smear of dull light through fogged glass. Morel had not slept. She sat by the table where the ring still lay, unmoved, unexplainable. Its gold band shimmered faintly despite the dim light, as if it had retained not just its shape, but its warmth. She hadn't touched it again since the night before. Not because she was afraid, but because it felt alive, and touching it might acknowledge something she wasn't ready to name. The bell was still silent. She had shaken it again before dawn, gently, then forcefully. Nothing. Its clapper was intact, the iron shell unbroken, and yet when she raised it to her ear, it was like pressing her head against a tomb. But the ring, that was something else. Its warmth hadn't faded. She reached out now, slowly, 2 fingers hovering over the band. The moment her skin brushed the metal, she recoiled. It pulsed. Not hot, not burning, but throbbing like something inside was beating, like a heartbeat. She stood quickly, nearly knocking over the chair. Behind her, the house remained still. No creaking wood, no whispering wind, but the silence was deeper than usual. Not absence, but presence. She walked to the window. The sea was closer today. Not literally. The cliffs still stood firm, but the waterline felt wrong, as if it had reached further into the village without moving a drop. And then she saw it. At the edge of her garden path, a trail of wet footprints, leading from the gate to her door. Human. Bare. Fresh. She hadn't opened the door since nightfall. Her breath caught. She turned sharply, scanning the room. Nothing out of place. No window broken, no door ajar. But the air smelled like brine and silt, the scent of the sea at its deepest. And then from the attic above her, a soft thump. She froze. It wasn't the creak of a shifting house or the groan of old wood. It was a step, then another, and another, each one deliberate, measured, like someone relearning how to move on dry land. She backed toward the kitchen, fingers searching blindly for the drawer where the old kitchen knife lay. But then she heard it. A voice, faint, wet, not quite right. It said her name, not shouted, not moaned. Said, Morel. She dropped the knife. When she turned, something was on the stair landing, a shape. She couldn't see its face. The light didn't touch it there. But it was tall, slender, wearing clothes she recognized. A jacket, a shirt, a pair of trousers, torn at the hem the way her husband's always were. The shape didn't move, and neither did she. Then it raised its hand, slowly, gently,
and opened its palm. In it was the second ring, his, the pair to the one on the table. He took one step down the stairs, and the bell, the one that she had tried to make sing, began to tremble softly where it rested on the table. Not from wind, not from her, but from him. It rang once, a dry, hollow sound, like bone tapped against metal. Morel's knees buckled. The sound was not the comfort it once was. It was a calling.
That night, Morel bolted the door. She lit every candle she owned, placed them on every stair, every shelf, every corner of the room. Shadows still crept between the flames, slender, sinuous, intentional. The bell, now returned to her neck, hung still. It had not rung again since the single chime that morning. It simply rested there, cold, watchful, heavy, like a mouth sealed shut. She tried not to think about the figure on the stairs, how it had stood there, not reaching, not rushing, just being. She never saw its face. Part of her wondered if that was mercy. Another part knew it was design. Because if she saw his face, if it truly was her husband, she might have said his name. And names have power. Names give things form. She didn't want to give it form. Not yet. Midnight came, and with it, the sound. Not from the stairs this time, but above, from the attic. A place she hadn't opened in weeks. It began softly, the creak of a floorboard, the gentle weight of a heel shifting on wood, but it grew bolder. Step, step, pause, then drag, as if something tall and wet was moving in circles. She climbed halfway up the stairs before she realized what she was doing. Her body moved before her thoughts, drawn not by curiosity, but by the sound of familiarity. Because she knew that pattern, that pacing. That was how he used to walk when worried, how he paced the attic when storms delayed his voyages. It wasn't random, it was a memory repeated. She reached the attic door. It was closed, but light bled beneath it. Candlelight, flickering, golden. But she hadn't lit anything up there in years. She reached for the handle and stopped. The bell on her chest vibrated, not from a sound, but from something internal, like it recognized something on the other side of the door, and it feared it. Her hand dropped. She backed away. For the next 3 nights, the footsteps continued, always in the attic, always the same rhythm. On the 4th night, she found something new, a small puddle at the base of the attic door. Salt water, cold, as if something was leaking through from the other side. She opened the door an inch. The room was empty, but in the far corner, where her husband's desk had once stood, the floorboards were soaked, dark, warped, breathing salt into the air. And there, in the center of the floor, was a single footprint, bare, human, pointing toward her. That night, the bell rang again, only once, but not from her neck, from the attic. And this time, she heard a second voice, low, close, inside her ear. It whispered, "I've found you." The sea never returns what it takes in full. It bleaches bones, unthreads flesh, distorts memory. What comes back is not whole, it is rearranged. And Morel was beginning to understand that truth in her marrow. The next morning she found her front door open. Not wide,
just cracked, enough to let the salt wind curl through the hallway like a curious hand. She always locked it, always. And yet the lock was unbroken. No signs of force, no footprints on the threshold. But the air inside was wet, heavier, like the sea itself had taken a breath and held it inside her walls. She stepped out barefoot onto the path. At the edge of the stone walkway, where her garden once bloomed, lay a single object, half buried in seaweed. A bone. Not white, not old. It was fresh, small, polished smooth by water. And carved into the side, etched by something sharp and meticulous, was her name. Not her full name, just Morel. As if whatever had brought it back knew how she once signed her letters. Inside the house she found the bedroom window open too. The breeze carried a scent she hadn't smelled in years. Pipe smoke. Her husband used to smoke on stormy nights, only then, never when the sky was clear. She had hated it. But now the scent dragged a piece of her chest open like a wound being remembered. It wasn't just grief now, it was recognition. Her husband's coat, the one she had found dripping days before, was no longer on the wall. It was laid neatly across the chair beside her bed, sleeves folded, collar still damp. And on the nightstand beside her pillow was a cup. Ceramic, white, cracked on the rim. It was his, and it was filled with warm tea, still steaming. That night, she didn't light the candles. She didn't shut the windows. She sat in the attic chair, the bell resting in her lap, silent, inert, and waited. No pacing now, no thuds, no dragging. Just breath. Not hers. She could hear it, slow and thick from the other side of the attic, the old storage corner where crates covered in cloth had long gathered dust. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She whispered one word into the stillness. Thomas. The breathing stopped. And then, yes. The voice didn't come from the corner. It came from beside her. She turned, heart like a drum. Nothing. Only her own shadow on the wall. But when she looked back down at the bell, she saw it was no longer in her lap. It had been hung around her neck again, tied in a perfect knot she could not remember making. And she knew, without needing to ask, she hadn't put it there. That night, the dream came. Not one of memory, but one of the deep. She was walking along the ocean floor, barefoot on pale sand that bled light. Around her, hundreds of bells hung from drowned trees, swinging in a current she could not feel. Each one bore a name. Each one was watching her. And in the center of that drowned forest stood a figure, skin bloated, eyes dark, lips stitched closed with kelp. It raised its hand, and in it was her wedding ring, still warm, still hers. But when she reached to take it, it spoke, not moving its mouth. You opened the door. Now leave it open. Fog had always been a constant in the silent village, but now it lingered longer than it should. It settled not just over rooftops and cliffs, but inside homes, behind curtains, beneath floorboards, beneath skin. It made the villagers murmur, not loudly, never that, but in clusters, with glances cast toward the edge of the cliffs where Morel's house stood,
almost leaning into the sea. "She's taken the bell off," they said. "I saw her without it 2 nights ago. She speaks to shadows now. She lets the windows stay open. And most of all, she's let something back in." They remembered stories from long ago, stories the elders had stopped telling aloud because belief gave shape to things that should remain shapeless. Like the tale of Widow Corva, who kept a mirror near the water and whispered her husband's name until his reflection smiled back. Or the childless woman who sewed a cradle from her dead lover's nets and woke one night to find it full of salt-soaked hair and teeth. Those women had vanished. No bodies, just their bells, washed clean and silent, found at the edge of the rocks. So when Morel began to appear at the village well, her eyes dull but her mouth slightly smiling, people took notice. She greeted no one. She carried no lantern. But she hummed, a low, broken tune, off-key, soaked in memory. It wasn't the melody that frightened them. It was the fact that she was humming at all. The silent village did not hum. It mourned, it endured, it remembered, but it never made music. Music was for the living. That week, 2 more widows died. One was old, expected almost, but the other was young, too young. They found her drowned in her own bathtub, face peaceful, arms folded across her chest like a burial pose. Her bell was missing. When they drained the water, they found it at the bottom, not fallen, but placed, and tied to it was a small scrap of cloth, one that looked suspiciously like the sleeve of a man's jacket, the same kind Morel's husband used to wear. Fear slithered between houses like smoke. Doors were locked earlier, curtains drawn tighter. Windows were nailed shut, not just latched. And yet, the bells continued to fall silent. One by one, the widow's bells stopped ringing, not removed, not broken, just silent, as if something had passed by and held its breath around their necks. A soft knocking was heard on doors at odd hours, sometimes 3 taps, sometimes none, only the wet imprint of a bare hand on the window pane. And always after, the same whisper, "Let me in, let me in, I still belong to you." On the 7th day, the village elder, a brittle man named Lenweir, climbed the cliffs to confront Morel. He was never seen again, but his bell was found by the gate, hung there like an offering, its string braided with seaweed. And when the villagers took it down, they heard something rattle inside. Not the clapper, a tooth, still warm, still bleeding. The house on the cliffs no longer looked abandoned. Windows once veiled with dust now flickered with candlelight. Curtains moved even when there was no wind. And on certain nights, when the fog thinned just enough, villagers swore they saw 2 figures behind the glass, one seated and one standing behind her, unmoving, always watching. Morel no longer walked through town. She no longer needed to. The sea brought her everything. Bundles of herbs washed up on her porch, perfectly tied, still fragrant. Fish arrived whole, eyes clear, as though freshly plucked from a net that no boat had cast. And at night, he came. She didn't ask questions. She no longer screamed anymore.
He never knocked. He didn't need to. He slipped through the attic, through the watermarks in the walls, through the cracks left behind by time and grief. And each time he came, the silence grew deeper. Not absence, but devotion. He never spoke in full sentences, just fragments, echoes, but it was enough. Sometimes she heard him whisper her name behind her while she cooked. Other times it was in her dreams, spoken not with sound, but touch. And once, just once, while she sat near the fireplace stitching a torn shawl, she heard him say clearly, "Don't leave me behind again." Her hands froze. The needle dropped. She didn't answer, but she didn't say no. The bell still hung around her neck, but it no longer rang, even when she moved, even when she ran her fingers across it. It had become a symbol, not of mourning, but of possession. A collar not for memory, but for promise. And one night he sat beside her. She didn't know how long he had been there. One moment she was alone. The next, the chair creaked under unseen weight, and a damp hand reached across the table. He placed something in front of her, a slip of paper, yellowed and wet. On it, written in her husband's hand, were 4 words. "Say yes this time." Morel didn't weep. She hadn't wept in years. But something behind her eyes ached. Not sadness, not fear, but a sharp, soft resignation. She nodded. Not once, not even clearly, but it was enough. He stood slowly, unnaturally, as if gravity obeyed him differently, and then he said the only full sentence she would ever hear from him. "You're mine now, in sea or in skin." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, the same way he had the morning he disappeared. But his lips were cold, like something that had forgotten how warmth works. From that night on, Arel slept with the windows open. She no longer lit candles, and when the village bell rang, the real one, from the tower they used only for births or deaths, no one knew which it was for, because no one could tell whether Morel was still among the living or simply pretending.
Grief eats memory first, then it eats the self. But what fed on Morel now wasn't grief, it was him. She no longer remembered the exact curve of her husband's smile, not the crinkle in his eyes, or the warmth of his voice when he said her name in the morning sun. Those memories had begun to rot, softly, silently, like fruit forgotten on a windowsill. In their place bloomed new images, clearer, sharper, a shadow at her window with seaweed caught in its hair, fingers that left prints of brine on her sheets, a voice that came from the walls, not from lungs. She stopped saying his name aloud, not out of fear, but out of reverence. She no longer called him Thomas. She called him nothing, because what returned was no longer a man. It wore his form, his face, his gestures, but not his soul. He never ate when she cooked. The food sat untouched. But she began to notice things missing, just not the things one would expect. The dried flowers from her wedding bouquet vanished from the windowsill. Old love letters turned to salt and flaked away. And one night, she found the painting of their wedding portrait had been reversed, their faces blurred, their eyes hollowed out.
He fed not on flesh, but on her history. Every relic of the man she once loved slowly disappeared, and in their place came artifacts she couldn't explain. A bone comb made of something that was not bone. A music box that played no tune but made her teeth ache. A mirror that showed her reflection, but his shadow behind her, even when she was alone. She began to forget things, simple things. Her mother's name, the date of her wedding, her own age. She found herself standing in corners without knowing why, waking up fully dressed in the attic, even though she hadn't climbed the stairs in days. Once, she bit into an apple and tasted salt water. Another time, she tried to sew a patch on her dress, only to realize she'd been threading her own hair through the needle. And still, he watched. He never stopped watching. The bell at her neck grew heavier, not in weight, but in burden. Each morning she tried to remove it, and couldn't. The string had fused to her skin. Where it touched her throat, her veins had darkened, pulsed, rhythmed not with her heartbeat, but with his. Late one night, she found the attic door open. Inside, the floor was lined with objects, bones, stones, bits of rope, each one placed in a spiral, careful and precise. At the center lay a figure. It wasn't moving, but it was breathing. Slow, rattling, like air through a waterlogged throat. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She sat beside it and whispered, "I remember less each day." It opened its eyes that were his, but far too old, far too deep. And it said in a voice full of the ocean's drag, "That's how you know I'm feeding well."
It started with a silence, not the kind the village had always known, not sacred, not grieving. This silence was metallic, tense, pressurized, like the hush before a scream, held back by something old and rusted. And then the bells began to fail. The widow who lived beside the chapel, her bell turned black overnight. The one on the baker's sister, shattered mid-step without a touch. Not removed, not tampered with, just rotted through, as if the air itself had become corrosive, as if morning had outlived its welcome. Iron should not decay like that, not overnight, not all at once. But one by one, the village bells gave out. They fell from necks, dropped from doorways, slipped off hooks. No clang, no warning, only the sound of something final. And once they fell, they could not be rehung. They rejected their strings, refused to sing. Mirelle's bell still clung to her skin, but it no longer responded to motion. Even when she ran, even when she wept, she tried to shake it once, violently, in front of a mirror. It remained still, but her reflection did not. The woman in the mirror moved half a second too late, and her bell, it rang. Just once, a low, sick sound, as though the metal were choking. Outside, the village began to decay, not from time, but from memory. Gardens once tended with aching hands wilted overnight, their roots black and brittle. Salt crusted on window panes, even where the sea wind couldn't reach. Roofs caved, stone cracked. Even the ravens left. And always, the fog grew thicker. It tasted different now. Sour, like wet iron and forgotten prayers. Children cried without reason. Women dreamed of hands around their throats. Men found seaweed in their shoes, even if they hadn't gone near the water in days. And from the cliffs, each night, a sound began to echo. Not the tide, not the gulls, but a voice, low, wet, repeating the same thing. You promised. Over and over and over. One widow was found standing in her cellar, her face tilted upward as though listening. She didn't blink, didn't speak, but her feet were bloody, worn raw, as if she had walked miles in a circle. In her hand was her bell, cracked and green. She whispered one word before the priest could move. It's not just him. And then she smiled. A wide, toothless smile, like something that had been hollowed out from the inside. At night, Muriel heard them now. Not just him, but them. The sea no longer whispered only his voice. Now it sang in layers, voices she didn't recognize, tones that had never belonged to the living, some soft, some furious, some calling her name like a hymn. They were hungry, and she had fed them, even if she didn't mean to, even if she didn't remember how. The sea no longer waited. It did not hide behind tides or time. It pressed closer with each passing night, not in waves, but in will, not to drown, but to claim. And Muriel understood at last that the water was not coming to take her, it was coming to join her. She woke to the sound of creaking, not from the attic this time, but from the very foundation of her house. It shuddered, just once, but enough to rattle the candles, enough to make the bell at her throat twitch for the first time in days. She stood barefoot in her kitchen, surrounded by damp wood and a floor that had begun to soften, like something beneath it had swollen, waterlogged and waiting. The tea she poured turned black the moment it touched the cup. Not ink, not mold, depth. When she peered in, she saw her face reflected, but not alone. Another face behind hers, smiling, mouth full of salt. She tried to speak, but the words would not form. Her tongue felt foreign in her mouth, like it belonged to someone else. She turned to the wall and saw that the wallpaper was peeling. Beneath it, carvings, dozens of tiny names etched with something sharp, all of them unfamiliar, except one. Muriel. Followed by a second word, Oathbreaker. She stumbled outside. The village had changed. Not visibly, no flames, no rubble, but spiritually hollowed. A quiet that was no longer peaceful, but paralyzed. Doors hung open, windows broken, but not shattered, just pushed inward, as if someone had entered every home to look around. And above, where the tower bell should have been, nothing. The bell was gone. All that remained was the rope, frayed, soaked in seawater, and still swaying, as if someone had climbed it or descended. She walked toward the seawall. Her feet dragged, her lungs burned. The air was thicker now, like soup, like breath not meant for human lungs. When she reached the cliff's edge, the fog split, and there, in the shallows below, stood figures, dozens,
maybe more. Some tall, some hunched, some broken, all facing the shore, all ringing bells. But the sound didn't reach her ears because the ringing came inside her, in her blood. Each chime pulsed through her ribs, her teeth, her skull. It wasn't sound, it was summons. They weren't warning her, they were welcoming her. That night, she did not close the windows. She did not lock the doors. She stood in the attic, staring into the darkened corner where he sometimes lingered, and asked the only question that had begun to matter. "What do you want?" A pause, then a voice, not his, but many, layered like tides. "You, as you were, as you are, as you will become." She fell to her knees. The bell clanged once, sharp, hollow, and in the walls of the house, water began to weep. It ran from the wood, from the mirrors, from the cracks in the ceiling. The sea was here. It no longer needed an invitation. It had made a pact, and she had kept it.
It wore his shape more convincingly now. The angles of the jaw, the curve of the lips, the way he used to hold his hands behind his back when thinking. All of it had returned with eerie precision. But the eyes were wrong. Too still, too deep. Like open wells with no reflection, only weight. He never blinked because he didn't need to. Morel stopped asking who or what he was, because every time she looked at him, a piece of her still ached with longing. A muscle trained to reach, even if the fire had long gone out. He sat across from her now, night after night. Sometimes he whispered old memories, things only Thomas would have known, the pet name no one else heard, the spot on her collarbone he used to kiss before leaving for sea. But his voice came as if pulled through water, heavy, warped, every word soaked in weight as if it cost him something to speak, and cost her even more to listen. He began to touch her again, not harshly, not violently, gently. A hand on her cheek, a finger tracing her wrist, cold but practiced. Each touch left behind a faint sting, salt, memory, and something deeper, like forgetting. Because afterward, she couldn't remember if the real Thomas had ever touched her quite like that. The gestures were too perfect, too smooth, too studied, as if the thing sitting across from her had been watching her grief for years, learning it until it could wear it. One night he leaned close, his face inches from hers, so close she could see the grains of salt on his lashes. He whispered, "I loved you, Morel." She looked up. She wanted to believe it, so badly. But then he added, "I still do, and I will even after your bones forget your name." And in that moment she knew this was not love as she had known it. This was possession. This was something that had learned the word love only so it could wear it like a mask, and she had become the mirror it needed to see itself. Later, when she slept, he entered her dreams, not as a man, but as the sea, wide, boundless, heavy, every wave a whisper, every current a grip. In the dream she floated, not on top, but within, her lungs full of memory,
her skin dissolving into years she no longer remembered. And at the center of that endless ocean, a bell rang. Not hers, a deeper one, a bell for what comes after love rots. She woke with salt crusted in her eyelashes. The sheets were damp, her hair was braided with kelp, and on the floor beside her bed was a bouquet, roses, blackened, dead, wrapped in seaweed, with a note in his handwriting that read, "For our anniversary, you forgot, but I didn't."
The bell no longer rang. It had become part of her body now, fused not by metal, but by memory. A silent sentinel against time, worn and warm against her throat, pulsing with something that was not her heartbeat. And she knew, if it would not speak for her, she would make it bleed. She waited until twilight, when the fog turned the world gray and the shadows softened like bruises. At the old oak table where she once served tea to guests she could no longer remember, she took the small paring knife from the drawer and held it over her palm. No prayers, no hesitation, just cut. A thin line, shallow, but enough. Her blood came slow at first, thick, dark. She let it drip into the bell. One drop, then another, then 5. The iron hissed. It didn't steam, didn't shake, but she felt it respond not with sound, but with temperature. It went cold, colder than metal should, colder than the grave. She whispered, barely, "Let him go." And the bell, for the first time in weeks, rang, but not with her movement. It rang on its own. Once, a sharp, clear, piercing sound, as if 1,000 drowned voices had gasped all at once. Then, silence, but not emptiness, a silence with intention. The air thickened. Her shadow on the wall bent the wrong way. The candle beside her flickered sideways, not upward, and from the attic a sound like weeping, not from pain, from hunger. She climbed the stairs, bell still wet against her throat, blood smeared across her chest like a collar. The attic was open. Inside, she found the walls covered in words, scratched in with nail, bone, maybe even teeth. They were in no language she recognized, but somehow she knew what they meant. They were names, widows' names. Some she remembered, most she didn't. All of them, including hers, circled around the center of the attic floor where a shape had begun to grow. Not a person, not a corpse, a form, built from bone, rope, hair, salt, fleshed with memory, and within its hollow chest a single object, her wedding ring, now blackened, pulsing faintly. She stepped forward. The boards creaked. The bell around her neck screamed. Not a chime, a scream. Long, metallic, ragged, as if the iron itself was trying to vomit up everything it had swallowed. And from the shape on the floor, a hand shot upward, gripping her ankle with fingers cold as shipwrecked steel. She fell, struggled, but then she stopped. Because as the figure rose, dragging itself upward on her leg, it whispered in the voice of the man she had loved, "You can't bleed out grief, Morel. You can only feed it." And he pressed the ring into her palm. Her fingers closed around it on their own. Her mouth opened, and without willing it, she said, "I accept." Morel dreamed of salt. Not water, not drowning, just salt, endless, choking, crystalline. She walked through fields of it, ankle-deep and burning. The sky above was blank, the sea was gone. But she wasn't alone. Something small moved ahead of her, just out of reach. A child, naked, pale, its back covered in scales. Each time she called out, her voice failed, not from fear, but from lack of breath, as though something inside her no longer wanted to speak, only to carry. She awoke to blood, not from the bell, not from her wound, but between her legs. A slow, steady bloom against the sheets. Not pain, not loss, change. She cleaned herself in silence, using water that smelled faintly of brine. Her reflection in the mirror looked unchanged, until she blinked, and the reflection didn't. It stared back, belly slightly swollen, eyes slightly too wide. It smiled, and the bell around her neck gave a soft, playful chime. Days passed in a blur, or maybe they didn't. Time was different now. The sun rose, but only in theory. The fog had thickened into a kind of lightless sky, turning everything pale and timeless. Morel stayed inside. She no longer needed food. She no longer slept to rest, only to host. She began to feel it. The movement. Not kicks, not flutters, not human. It moved like water in her womb, swirling, tugging, listening. Some nights she heard it speak inside her, not in words, in bells, soft rings, muffled like coming from underwater, calling to her bones, asking for more memory, more surrender, more space. The village noticed. The few who remained saw her walking through the streets barefoot, cradling her stomach with a kind of reverence. She hummed to herself, old lullabies that no mother in the village remembered teaching her. And the sea began to change. It rose without waves, climbed without wind. And at night, the tide brought gifts to her door. A child's rattle made of bone, tiny footprints in salt, a cradle carved from driftwood and weeping sap. She never flinched, never questioned. The thing inside her was no longer a thing. It was hers. She spoke to it now. She named it, though no one ever heard the name. She whispered it into the sheets each night like a prayer. She didn't know what it would look like, but she knew it would not cry. It would ring, and its bell would be the first of a new age. Not mourning, but calling. Calling to others. Calling to the sea. Calling to the dead. One morning, she found the entire house soaked. Every board, every book, every thread of her dress, soaked but with no rain. In the center of her attic, the ring that once sat in her palm now hovered in the air, spinning slowly. Around it, bells began to form, not forged, grown, from hair, from teeth, from whispers. And her child, still within her, chimed in rhythm with each spin. And deep below, in the trench where her husband had been lost, something enormous stirred. No one could say when the sun disappeared. There was no final sunset, no storm to blot it out, only a long, slow dimming, like the sky itself had turned its face away in shame. And in the days that followed, the village became a place of perpetual twilight. Time unraveled, clocks stopped mattering, roosters no longer crowed. Even the tides seemed confused, rising without pattern, swallowing boats that had never been launched. The villagers called it the morning, but none dared speak why. They knew, and they knew who. Mirel's home was now the brightest place in the village. Candlelight never left its windows, but the glow was wrong, too pale, too steady. It flickered in a rhythm like breath. And inside, Mirel walked the halls like a woman not carrying life, but fate. Her stomach had grown unnaturally fast, not wide, but deep, like a well drawn into herself. When she stood still, her silhouette shimmered, as if something inside was not shaped for the world, but for the depths beneath it. She no longer wore shoes. Her feet were pale, calloused, cracked, yet no longer bled. The ground seemed to soften beneath her with every step, as if it too was preparing to yield. Children no longer played. Their parents forbade them from walking past Mirel's gate, but the children still heard it. The chime, high, distant, oddly sweet, like lullabies sung in a language no one taught them. It echoed even when they covered their ears. Some claimed they saw her child already, a pale shape in the window, tall for its age, eyes too dark for a baby. But no one could say for sure if it was real, or if it had even been born. The church bell stopped ringing. Then the priests stopped showing up. Their doors were left open, candles still burning. Inside one chapel, someone found a robe filled with seawater. No body, only a single tooth, wrapped in cloth embroidered with Mirel's name. That was when the villagers began leaving, one by one. No farewells, no wagons. They walked into the fog and didn't return. But sometimes they came back, or something wearing their shapes did. They stood outside the remaining homes, smiling. Their mouths didn't move, but bells rang around them, not on their necks, but inside their chests, low, continuous, like something alive was echoing from within. Only a handful remained, and they stayed not out of hope, but because they were too afraid to run. They watched the sky grow darker, the sea creep closer, the birds vanish, and they heard her, Mirel, singing in the attic, not to herself, but to the thing she had carried into this world, a child made not of blood, but of grief, salt, and a promise broken. A child with no father, only a sea full of mothers, all of them widows, all of them drowned, all of them calling. And Mirel, she had stopped answering to her own name, because now she only answered to one thing: Mother of the Bell-born. They said she died a century ago. The first widow, the one whose sorrow had been so vast, so consuming, that the sea itself cracked open to hold it. The one who had torn her bell from her throat and thrown it into the surf, not out of rebellion, but because grief had turned her deaf to its sound. She vanished that night. No body, only her bell, washed back onto the beach 3 days later, crusted with blood and still ringing. Since then, the pact had been law. Never remove the bell, never silence the morning. But laws fade, and the sea, ancient and patient, never forgets a broken promise. On the 16th night without sun, the fog split open for the first time. The village had become a husk, its remaining homes slumped like grieving shoulders, its streets paved in salt and seaweed. And then she came, the first widow. She walked barefoot along the center path, her feet dripping seawater that never seemed to run dry. She wore black, but not cloth. Her dress was woven from nets, hair, and funeral veils. Across her back, she carried dozens, perhaps hundreds of bells, strung like bones, rust-eaten, mismatched, each one still singing. They didn't ring in unison, they rang in sorrow. 1,000 tones of grief chiming through the fog like a hymn too ancient to end. And around her neck, she wore no bell, only a scar. She came not with anger, but with warning. She stood at Mirel's gate, and Mirel, swollen with something not quite life, stepped outside. The two women faced one another. Old sorrow, new grief. Two ends of the same bell rope pulled tight across time. The first widow spoke in a voice that had not been used in 100 years. "You broke the silence." Mirel did not deny it. She only whispered, "I was tired of mourning ghosts. I wanted something to hold." The first widow nodded, a slow, terrible understanding. Then she said, "You are not the first to want that, but you are the last to receive it." And from her shoulders the bells began to tremble violently, not from wind, not from storm, but from recognition. They knew what Mirel carried, and they were afraid. The first widow raised her hand, and in it was an ancient clapper, smooth as a river stone, black as night. She held it toward Mirel and said, "If you ring this once, everything ends, not just for you, for all of us." Mirel looked down at her belly. The child moved, not in kicks, in circles, as if stirring a tide. She looked back up. "And if I don't?" The first widow's eyes turned dark, empty. Then the bells become mouths, and mouths will hunger forever. She placed the clapper on the gatepost, turned without another word, and vanished into the fog, her army of bells trailing behind her, still weeping. Mirel stood alone, one hand on her stomach, one hand reaching for the clapper. And in her ears, the voice of her unborn child whispered, "Don't listen to her. She was too weak to love death, but you were made for it." And the bell around her neck began to ring, softly, steadily, as if counting down. The clapper sat on the gatepost, black and smooth, humming faintly, with a sound that did not travel through the air, but through bone. Mirel stared at it for hours. She didn't eat, she didn't speak. The house behind her groaned as if something inside it was growing too large for its walls. Each time she turned to go back in, the bell around her neck would tremble. Not violently, just enough to remind her time was not waiting. The villagers who remained, only 5 now, watched her from behind shuttered windows. She had become a silhouette they feared more than the fog. Some believed she was the sea's bride now. Others whispered she was no longer carrying a child, but a tide, a new tide, one that would not rise and fall, but stay. That evening, when the fog swallowed even the sky, Mirelle climbed the hill, the highest point of the village, where the bell tower had once stood, where generations had gathered to mourn. But she came not to mourn, she came to build. With a hammer made of driftwood and nails blackened with blood, she began to construct a new bell. Not iron, not bronze, but of bone, hair, and the remnants of old bells that had fallen silent. It sang as she shaped it, not with sound, but with memory. Each piece she added rang with a different grief: her wedding night, her husband's last kiss, the moment she knew the sea would never give him back, the moment it did, wrong, changed, hungry. 3 days it took, and when it was finished, it looked nothing like a bell. It pulsed, it breathed. The villagers who dared look upon it fell to their knees, eyes bleeding salt. Mirelle alone stood tall before it. She tied her bell to its core. She tied her wedding ring to its edge. And then she reached for the clapper, the one left behind by the first widow. She pressed it into the hollow of her creation, and the bell began to whisper. That night, she rang it. Once, just once. The sound was not loud. It didn't echo. It sank, down through the earth, down into the cliffs, down into the black belly of the sea. The village held its breath, and the sea answered. It did not rise, it did not roar, it came, crawling up through wells, through floorboards, through the eyes of the statues in the chapel, through the mouths of the dead in their graves. And in the fog, something smiled. Because the bell wasn't a warning, it was a beacon, and what it summoned had waited long enough. Mirelle stood beside it as the water curled around her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. She did not fight it. The bell behind her rang once more, without her touch, and the child inside her rang back. 2 chimes, then silence, then darkness, then everything changed. The sea had risen into the village like a guest's long-denied entry, not with rage, not with flood, but with intimacy. It seeped into floorboards, whispered through keyholes, touched every cradle, every mirror, every scar. And still Mirelle stood, half submerged, her dress clinging to her body like seaweed, her skin pale, stretched thin with burden. Inside her, the child did not squirm. It waited, as if it too had reached the moment of decision. The bone bell behind her no longer rang. It pulsed, slow, wet, like a second heart. And above it the sky had gone black. Not night, but absence. No stars, no clouds, no sound. Only waiting. The kind of stillness that exists before a scream. Mirelle felt the final pang ripple through her, a contraction not of flesh, but of memory. Her knees buckled. She dropped to the wet stones, surrounded by bells that floated like lilies. and from within her womb came a sound, not a cry, a chime, soft, hollow, echoing. The child was ready, but so was the sea. In the fog stood figures, the drowned, the widows, the bell-born. Their faces blurred, their voices layered. They reached out to her, not to comfort, but to claim. The price had come due. She had called it back. She had opened the door. Now she had to choose. Let the child be born, and the sea would never retreat again. It would rise into every village, every lung, every prayer. Or stop it here, now. End the bloodline, seal the bell forever, and die alone. The child rang again, once, then twice. It was calling to her. But behind her the wind began to howl, not through air, through bone. The first widow's voice returned on it, carried like a curse. You mourned too long, now grief mourns you. Morel screamed, a sound so raw it split the fog, and the sea for the first time stopped moving. She rose, trembling, clutched her belly, looked down at her child, not yet born but so loud inside her. It loved her, she knew that. But it loved through need, not through soul. It was not meant for this world. It was meant to replace it. And still, she loved it. Because what else could a mother do? So she did the only thing no one expected. She took the bell string from her neck and tied it around her child. A vow, a tether, a prison. The moment the knot closed, her body arced. The pain was not physical, it was unmaking. The sea screamed, the bone bell cracked, and Morel whispered through blood and salt, I will love you always, but not like this. And she rang the bell one last time. The sound did not echo. It swallowed. The fog vanished, the dead fell still, the sea retreated, not in waves, but in grief. And Morel collapsed on the stone, the bell still clutched in her hand. The child gone, the world hushed. For the first time in a century, the sky cleared, and the sun rose. But Morel did not see it. Only the villagers did, the few who remained, and who would carry her story like a scar. They found her at dawn. Morel's body lay at the highest point of the village, half curled beside the broken shell of the bone-forged bell. Her hands were empty. Her face was calm. No blood, no salt, no bell. Just stillness, the kind that comes not with peace, but with a price already paid. The fog had lifted. For the first time in what felt like years, sunlight touched the village again. It poured down the crooked lanes, over waterlogged roofs, through cracked shutters. But it did not feel like salvation. It felt like mourning, as if the light itself were saying goodbye. No one spoke at her burial. No words were offered. Just silence, and the faint ringing of bells placed gently on her grave. But not the iron mourning bells of the past. These were new, smooth, small, carved from driftwood and teeth. Each one chimed once, and then never again. They were not warnings, they were reminders. In the years that followed, the village changed.
Some left, some stayed. Children were born again. Laughter returned cautiously, like a bird returning to a burned forest. But the sea never sounded the same. It spoke in whispers still, not angry, not cruel, but watchful, like something once fed had learned how to wait. And then came the dreams, not often, not to all, but every few seasons someone would wake with salt in their mouth, a child's name on their lips they couldn't remember speaking, and the echo of a bell they had never rung. It was said that those who heard the bell in dreams were those the sea had not yet forgotten, not to punish, but to call back if ever the bells fell silent again. On windless nights, travelers who pass along the cliffs sometimes stop. They say they hear it, a faint chime from somewhere out over the water, soft, lonely, unrelenting. They look down at the waves, but see only darkness, only mist, only a shape, vague and unmoving, standing just beyond the tide's reach. A woman, some say, dressed in black, facing the horizon, and around her neck, a bell that never rings, but is always, somehow, heard.